Mr. Tillerson, congratulations on your nomination. They say that those who refuse to learn the lessons of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. The president-elect has said that the Iraq War was a big, fat mistake. He's said this many, many, many times. I was wondering if you agree with the statement, and if you do agree with the statement, how it will inform your judgment as to the future of the Middle East and the other conflicts that we are engaged or possibly engaged in the Middle East.
Senator, I alluded to the Iraq War in my opening comments when I indicated that actions over the past decades, while well-intended, had unintended consequences that in the end did not achieve the stability that we sought or the national security. And I think in that regard, the decision to go into Iraq and change the leadership in Iraq upon reflection was perhaps did not achieve those objectives. We do not have a more stable region in the world, and our national security has not been enhanced or is still certainly under threat today.
I think that's an important point that we talk about whether our national security was enhanced. And I think sometimes it gets lost in the emotions of these are terrible, evil people, X, whichever country we're talking about, and we have to do something about it. And in reality, we maybe forget that really what we're trying to do is to be protecting our vital national interest. Another statement that President-elect Trump has made is that the U.S. should stop racing to topple foreign regimes that we know nothing about, that we shouldn't be involved with. This is kind of interrelated to the last question, but I think is also important in the sense that there are some within the foreign policy community who say, oh, we must go in and topple the regime in Iran. It'll be a cakewalk. It'll be, they'll welcome us with open arms. But one of the interesting things you find is you meet Iranian Americans, many of whom lost all of their land, all of their wealth, and you ask them about Iran, and you say, would it be a good idea to militarily, invade Iran? And they say completely the opposite, that much of Iran is younger, much of Iran is pro-Western, and that with the first bomb that is dropped, you'll reverse, a lot of goodwill that is potentially there when Iran does finally change its regime on its own. But I think it's important because we do, and nobody wants Iran to have nuclear weapons. Nobody wants Iran to be an aggressor in the region. And at the same time, I think it is important that we look at the lessons of the Iraq War. The Iraq War actually emboldened Iran, made Iran stronger. And so the questions are, same thing with Libya. We toppled the regime in Libya. But I guess the question is with regard to Iran, those who are advocating, that it'll be a cakewalk, that we should have military regime change, what do you think of that advocacy, and what do you think of, I guess, the Donald Trump statements with regard to regime change?
Well, I think you've described it in many ways, and the same way I would see it is that what is in the best interest of our national security? And I think this is where these priorities sometimes come into conflict of our values and the projection of our American values and our desire and out of our compassion for the mistreatment of people, the violation of human rights, oppressive regimes. We want those people to have what we have, but balancing that against our national security interest. And what's most important is that we protect the American people first. And this is where sometimes I think our priorities, we have too many priorities, and therefore we lose sight of what is the most important. Any decision to affect a change of leadership in a country by force, it cannot be taken lightly. And I think the question that one has to answer is that I've posed a couple of times: what comes next? And in the case of Libya, I think that was the failing in the decision to change the regime there. No one had a clear plan or view of what would come next. That's what we're experiencing and have experienced somewhat in Iraq. And it is the question in Syria when people talk about changing the leadership there. What comes next? Certainly, making a decision to use force is a serious, serious decision because we know it will come at a cost of precious American lives. So I think that is important, and if confirmed to Secretary of State, my job is to make sure we never get there. My job is to chart out other pathways by which we can have a steady progress towards causing regimes who oppress their people to change their behavior and use all the other tools available to us. Having said that, I do think that we have to be clear-eyed about the threat Iran poses today and ensure that we have taken all steps appropriate through all mechanisms available to contain that threat and to limit their ability to grow that threat. And in particular, not just on the nuclear, acquiring a nuclear weapon, but more importantly, their widespread support of terrorism around the world. We have to disrupt that.
Thank you. With regard to foreign aid, there's been a lot of love for foreign aid going around today, but I think there's another side that we ought to think about. There are many, many, many reports talking about corruption within foreign aid, that we give it to developing countries and 70% of it's stolen off the top. The Mubarak family in Egypt, everybody, loved the Mubaraks. They were pro-Western, pro-American, and yet they're said to be worth about $15 billion. I don't think they've ever created anything other than they skim a little bit off the top of everything that comes into the country. We've given them $60 billion, and they're worth $10 or $15 billion. I believe it was the Equatorial Guinea that had one of their sons stopped in Paris a few years ago, loading about 10 different cars onto an airplane that were all worth, $200,000, $300,000 cars. So there's a lot of corruption. Now, some of the things that have been mentioned are more directed towards either third-party charities or private entities. I would argue that these are a lot less bad, but I would argue that we can't blithely just look at foreign aid and say, oh, it's all great and it's all going to a good cause. Sometimes it actually works in the opposite way. And I'll give you an example in Egypt. We gave so much, and the Mubaraks took so much of this money. But some of it they actually spent because we have provisions. They have to buy stuff from us with the money. It's sort of this, creation of economic business kind of game that we do. But one of the things that they bought from us was tear gas. And so when they had these big democratic protests in Cairo, they were being doused with tear gas from the U.S., and they would pick the canisters up on the street. And I would argue that soft power isn't maybe giving a warm, soft, fuzzy feeling for America, that in supporting many people who really are not, pro-human rights or pro-American interests, that actually sometimes the foreign aid backfires on us because they resist those leaders who are using undemocratic and forceful authoritarian means on their own people, that it backfires. But I would appreciate your comments on whether or not you see any kind of difficulty or problems with corruption within foreign aid or things that need to be reformed.
Senator, I'm very aware of, and even in my prior work, I have seen the examples of what you described, or even in disaster relief cases where foreign assistance is flown in, food supplies, and while they're literally being unloaded at the airport, military forces are picking them up and taking them away to be sold. So it is all the challenge. The challenge is never in the intent and our compassion and what the need we're trying to address. The challenge is always in the execution, and I do think that it is important that we have as well-developed execution plans if we're going to deliver aid into a country where we know this is a risk. What can we do in the execution of the delivery of that aid? And if it's a disaster relief, are there other agencies we can partner with to limit that type of theft going on? In terms of development assistance, to the extent we do not give grants directly to governments, but whether we give them to particular projects or perhaps partnering agencies or public-private sector initiatives which are executed by credible NGOs, so that the money just never passes through the hands, that's the preferred mechanisms, I think.
And then one final point I would make, and you don't necessarily need to comment on this, is that it's not only corruption, but it's unintended consequences. As a business person, you'll immediately recognize this, and I think even right and left actually agree on some of this. If you dump Haiti with rice for 10 years, you ruin the ability of them to have their own rice market and to grow their own rice. If you want to give them rice during the middle of a famine, that's one thing. But you have to be very careful about having a big heart, small brain syndrome that we ruin their local economies sometimes with aid as well. But I appreciate you thinking about corruption and then also thinking about unintended consequences of our aid. Thank you.
Thank you. Before turning to Senator Murray,